dimensions of the credibility gap. The gap and its dimensions. Here it is in cold print, but it should be noted that the obliqueness of the expression has been consciously accepted because it corresponds to the structure of the phenomenon itself, insofar as obliqueness is aesthetically homologous to being suspect. Initially, it should be established the clever term credibility gap has so easily been able to win a place in political vocabulary in the last few years because they were the years when system theoretical, marketing strategic, and theatrical categories overturned the field of moral political discourses without encountering hardly any resistance. From now on, we not only have to deal with information gaps, energy gaps, the Fulda gap, preferred gate of entry for Russian armoured forces, market gaps and technology gaps, but also with ethical gaps such as that of credibility or predictability, which act as the field of operation of interaction technologies. Whoever embraces this linguistic prescription shows they have understood the basic rule of pragmatism. The management of a problem is to be considered its solution until further notice. Thus, the essential political talent proves to be the ability to make yourself comfortable in a deplorable state of affairs. And if we speak of the dimensions of the credibility gap, then deficiency is point-blank positivized. It is no longer a deficit, but a market. From then on, we are no longer to understand the gap as a torn hole in material or as a distance between two parameters. Rather, it is an independent phenomenon. This positivization also has an advantageous effect, as it tends to occur with some productive demoralizations. It helps by integrating a critical potential into the very description of the matter from its outset. A kind of resistance forces itself between the substance, politics, and the attribute, credible, that no longer allows smooth connections to emerge. Credible politics would amount to a round square. At this point, the chin of the correspondent of a Hamburg daily newspaper drops to his chest with discouragement. For him, the morning is lost. For this is not the kind of language that keeps us going. To give an example, the most credible policy today is without doubt that of the Iranian Ayatollahs, since the discrepancy between what politicians are and what they do is nowhere else in the world as trivial as it is there. They are by far the most characterful, credible politicians of our time. Compared to them, the newer Chinese politics, for example, is almost shockingly unreliable, volatile, and in a fascinating way, devoid of character. One can understand, of course, why Western professional politicians, who are tired of the chronic doubt being cast on their morality, have originated the fantasy that the credibility gap ought to be closed. For one, they would like to see the currents of approval flow unbroken from the governed to the rulers. They dream of being a pure medium of the people just once in their lives and of embodying a credible, undiluted emanation of common interests. They balk at the morally precarious insight that the lack of credibility as such is constitutive of the modern concept of politics as a whole. Regardless of their reservations against it, we must insist, based on the law of the matter, that credibility is only possible for modern politics in the form of disclosure of the stipulations of its incredibility. Here too belongs a history lesson. Since the age of absolutism, more precisely since the regicidal phase of the French Revolution, political rule in the West has been gradually desacralized. From that point on, political power has stood less in the light shining from above and more under the pressure of approval from below. Such a change in the very basis of legitimacy has been accompanied by a profound transformation of how power and rule are enacted. It can be recognized in the form of an increasing depersonalization of power, bureaucratization of politics, and prioritising of decision-making procedures over the acute urgency of problems. In this way, power has become more diffuse and more indirect on the one hand, and more penetrating and ubiquitous on the other. These are banalities, but they clarify why it has become difficult to see political events under a transfiguring or some other kind of higher light. The secularization of the political has liquidated the reserves of romantic loyalty and patriarchal attachment that may have existed between the authorities and populations in the age of direct rule. As its secular and rational distinguishing feature, modernity does not allow for a sacral political restoration. The political realm is now either a sober workplace or a battlefield for those who manage to format their existential passions into practical interests. According to a modern understanding, politics is what remains when passions are excluded and pushed into the religious, aesthetic and erotic districts of the private. It is only through this drastic modification that people can be turned into political subjects of the modern kind. Only when they reduce themselves from beings who have passions to subjects who have interests will they attain the status of political persons. One can assume that the roots of any unease at the lack of credibility in politics are to be sought in the anthropological stylization of Homo politicus as a modern subject of interest. For the individual can only become a political subject to the extent that they are able to refrain from what gives their existence the authentic, the credible trait. What modernity calls the political only appears by neutralizing what is existentially most important. Emerging from repression, politics must at the same time impose itself as the most important surrogate for that which is most important. It can only succeed insofar as it ensures that nothing else becomes more important than politics. For this reason, politics is, as Bismarck claimed, the art of the possible, the art of the next best. Its passion is the neutralization of passions. Such a definition of politics as statesmanship can be traced back to the absolutist age, when the early modern state began to establish itself as a meta-absolutism of a special kind over the militantly absolutized religious passions and creeds, where the mortal God, as Hobbes defines the modern state, established his regiment. Confessions of faith and passions became neutralized into private matters and should under no permissible circumstances come into question as the causae belli, especially when it comes to civil wars. One can verify the validity of this rule by the exceptions of Northern Ireland or Lebanon that prove it, both cases of unsuccessful neutralization of passions and failed politicization or funding of interests. The political double figure of the sovereign and the subject has been in effect ever since absolutism. It lives on in the legal figure of the citizen, where moments of subjection and sovereignty are made into a kind of self-subjection. The citizen of the state is the political figure in whose own interest it is to have political interests and not passions. It is precisely because passions must be privatized and neutralized in the political culture of modern times that the corresponding political subjects are constitutionally abstract. In this fact, the political achievement of modernity and its greatest weakness become one and the same. Although its social systems are built upon abstraction from passions, they are forced to produce a passion for the abstract in a deeply paradoxical way. Otherwise, the psychosocial brackets that are supposed to hold the great systems together would immediately break apart. But warming people to the cold will always be a problematic endeavour in the long run. One might get the impression that this is an alchemist piece of art that the anthropological equipment of Homo sapiens sapiens has not provided for. But perhaps another sapiens is yet to be added. Exceptions to these paradoxes can be divided into only two groups: those who are engaged in politics as a profession and cannot fail to place any private passions they still might have at the service of the profession as a subjective subsidy, and those who passionately and aggressively engage in acute political issues as laymen. When this happens, passions are no longer private, and political scientists speak of social movements. It is not for nothing that this expression has alarming connotations. It reminds us that what is most important can return to the political arena at any time. Indeed, social movements prove that the modern reduction of passions to interests is an anthropologically unstable operation that can be thrown into question overnight by so-called fundamentalist upheavals. Career politicians are naturally suspicious of such fundamentalism, for the rules of the game in their profession are that people do not have fundamental beliefs, but rather principles, not passions but interests, not axioms but options. Thus, whoever wishes to study the credibility gap where it originally opens up must understand how the modern political subject comes into being through a reduction of the self into the representation of interests and civic self-subjugation. And because individuals would eventually atrophy within such reductions, compensations are vitally important. Within existential jargon, such compensations are called engagements. Engagement is passion in the form of decision. The only forms open to engagement lead either to professionalism or to fundamentalism. Both forms of compensation are rightly perceived as something even less credible than what they are supposed to aid in becoming more credible. By categorically dividing the political class into doers and eccentrics, we instinctively identify the two great variants of modern political lack of credibility. The primary dimension of the credibility gap, we claim, is therefore not the so-called, quote-unquote, alienation of politics from the quote-unquote authentic interests of the population, as trivial political scientists would have us believe, but the alienation of the population from their passions in favour of those interests that are implanted in them, like an artificial heart. And incidentally, these are almost always the interests in mobilisations. The primary problem is not that institutions become independent and separate themselves from the grassroots, but that the grassroots separate themselves from themselves in order to participate as political subjects in the mobilisation project of the modern age. Therefore, credibility is primarily an issue not of political ethics, but of political anthropology. On the other hand, explaining the credibility gap is caused by the alienation between politicians and the population only captures its secondary dimension. On the other hand, explaining the credibility gap as caused by the alienation between politicians and the population only captures its secondary dimension. No one will deny that this too has its pitfalls and can be a source of unease with respect to politics, but compared to the anthropologically consequential transformation of individuals into politically interested subjects, the fact that there can be no purely representational relationships between so-called mandates and political officers because the idiosyncrasies of the officers undermine pure representation is a comparatively harmless phenomenon. Since everyone in the political world theatre is their own member of parliament who tries to represent their own interests, it is to their benefit to have optimal representatives of those interests. But as long as politics has continued by the exclusion of what is most important, the bland aftertaste of all actions in the spirit of advocacy cannot be eliminated. The people whose interests are represented look into a mirror when they look at their representative, and self-knowledge comes into play when the person looking back at them does not elicit enthusiasm. With an inimitable mixture of subservient suspicion and gloating disdain, they observe the dealings of the political class that represents their rightful representatives. If politicians are almost always unpopular, it's not because they are alienated from the people, but because they are the spitting image of them. The people are rarely so deluded as to find themselves popular. If they are at their wits' end when it comes to themselves, they will vote for those infallibly guaranteed to sink them even deeper into the state. That is precisely what makes up the psycho-political secret of neoconservative regimes currently predominant in almost the entire Western world. They accurately reflect back the reaction of collective flight into carry on as usual, where the dumbfounded majorities of interested voters have established themselves. Arm in arm with these majorities, neoconservatism has opened up an age of political unsavouriness. It has enforced its own inability to be shocked by itself as official etiquette. But its popularity cannot be separated from its simultaneous unpopularity. It finds voter majorities because they find a predictable lack of credibility in it. The public always has the most reasons to consider politicians untrustworthy when they are the way the public wants them to be. As long as they adequately represent the people as they are, politicians will be as untrustworthy as the people are. Whoever governs in the name of the people reduces one's mandate to an indefinable, unstable, fluctuating, something that is disinterested in anything but interests. This something periodically lends clear expression to its confusion through general, free, equal, and secret elections. The downfall of people's representatives is not that they stray too far from the people, rather it is because they do not distance themselves far enough, that they are unable to prioritise their receptivity to what is urgent over their interest in interests. Politics is always too close to the citizens, too close to people who stand next to each other for miles in order to represent themselves optimally, to the right of the inevitable, to the right of death and life.